Welcome to Certified Fetty's webinar series, The Importance of the Interview in Title IX Investigations. This webinar, the third and final part in our three-part series, is about understanding the continuum of an interview. Before we begin this recording and introduce you to our speakers, we would like to provide a link to the Introduction to the Fetty Methodology paper, which details the elements of the Fetty interviewing methodology if you wish to dive deeper. And without further ado, we will turn it over to our esteemed speakers.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carrie Hull. Very excited to welcome you to our third part of our webinar series, The Importance of the Interview in Title IX Investigations. This is part 3, Understanding the Continuum of an Interview. We are very happy to be back with you and hope that you had a chance, if you weren't able to join us for parts 1 and 2, to view those videos that are available. And just as a reminder, this video for part 3 will also be available. So as we are providing information today and we are going over the topics, please know that we will make sure that this is available. So you don't have to worry too much about taking any notes or writing anything down if we go past it before you have a chance to, because you will have access to all of the content that we talk about today. I'm very happy that I see a lot of people are joining, and I really want to encourage, since this is our last chance in this series to get together, that you take the opportunity to ask any questions that you have. Please don't wait for the end to put those into the chat. We do have somebody that is monitoring those, and we'll make sure that either during the interview or towards the end of, not the interview, the webinar, we will be answering those. We will be doing our best to provide you with information about any questions that remain for you. So it will be myself today. My name is Carrie Hull. I will be with you for the entire webinar. Just a little bit on my background. I am currently the Director of Certification for Certified Fetty, where I do a lot of training over each of the years. And then I also provide quite a bit of consultation to law enforcement agencies, government agencies, institutions of higher learning, and then also some private entities as well, both within the United States and out of the United States. For the purposes of this webinar series, I'll be focusing on my work with higher education and just trying to provide some context and some anecdotal experiences that the teams I've worked with in those organizations, how they've utilized the things that we are going to be talking about in this third part, as well as the parts 1 and 2 and the information that you learned from those webinars. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my co-presenter, Jeff, for a moment so you can hear a bit about him.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeff Nolan. I'm a senior counsel at Holland Knight. My office is in Boston, but I work with colleges and universities and employers around the country on a range of issues, and some of which do involve investigations and certainly do focus on Title IX related issues. In that context, have had a good opportunity to work with Carrie and Certified Fetty on matters like this, and have published a good bit about how to integrate trauma-informed approaches into Title IX investigations in a way that is neutral and fair to all parties, so that we can get our very best information that we're able to through our interviews, that we can then use them for our investigative purposes. So again, I look forward to working with Carrie on this and to chiming in where the things that she's covering are implicating legal issues. On that point, I was fortunate to be involved with the National Association of College University Attorneys publication, NACUA, a NACUA note published in February of 2018 that was cited in the preamble to the May 2020 regulations, focused on how we can promote fairness in trauma-informed investigation training, and focused on how to ensure that when we use a trauma-informed approach, even if it was developed initially to work with individuals who are coming forward who were reporting that they had been subjected to a traumatic event, or it was clear from the context that a trauma had occurred that had been experienced by them, that we're able to also use similar practices, and I would say identical practices, in working with all parties to a matter, including respondents. And I fleshed that out further in a white paper that was published in the summer, July of 2019, that's available at the link that's on your screen. That's on my website at Holland Knight. That was cited 8 times in the preamble, essentially for the proposition that trauma-informed training can continue to be used and trauma-informed approaches can continue to be used in Title IX investigations, so long as you do it in a way that's scrupulously fair and equitable to both parties. That concept was further validated by the Biden administration's Department of Education in a July 20th, 2021 Q&A document, which specifically said at question 28, schools may continue to use trauma-informed approaches to respond to a formal complaint of sexual harassment, but clarifies, citing to the preamble to the regulations, that we can apply those techniques, practices, and approaches, but we have to do it in a way that is following procedural requirements and is equitable and fair. And in support of that, they cited to a page in the regulations that are in the preamble that cites this white paper. So this concept remains strong, was strong even in the prior administration, certainly remains so in the current administration, which is all good news. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to go into the continuum of interviewing and other aspects that we're going to cover today. And again, look forward to chiming in and to your questions when we have time for that at the end.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. So Jeff and I are going to try our best to make sure that we leave a lot of time for questions. We sort of laughed about that a little earlier. I can be a little long-winded on this topic of interviewing. And so I appreciate everybody that's giving us your time, both today and if you are able to watch this as well. We promise to leave room at the end for questions and not to go over the 2-hour time slot that we have allotted. But as a reminder, please make sure to put those questions in as soon as you have them so that we have a better chance of making sure that we do leave time to respond to them. What we're going to be covering today is just like we did in parts 1 and 2, a very brief, this time, overview of FETI, because I want to be really clear that even though Certified FETI is sponsoring this webinar and has coordinated the webinar, this is not a training in the forensic experiential trauma interview, and we will not be teaching how to do a FETI. This is, we want to make sure this is applicable regardless of the interviewing methodology that you choose to use. So we won't be focusing down on that specifically. However, it is the interviewing methodology that I use. And so most of my anecdotes, a lot of the information that I will be providing does incorporate FETI. And I just wanted to make sure if you haven't had a chance to hear what that is, you have a very brief understanding of that. We will then move on to options for closing your interview and then to options for documentation. This is a really big part of being able to understand the continuum of an interview. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time on that. Look forward to any questions that you have on that. I know that this can be an interesting application within the higher ed context for documenting and the things that you're allowed to do by policy or required to do by policy. And I'm very happy Jeff is going to be here to provide his insights on that. We then are going to be really wrapping up parts 1 and 2, bringing it into parts 3 with this idea of what is the continuum mindset for information gathering. So we'll be spending some time on that. And then Jeff and I, with the time that we have left, really want to just note what are these downstream effects that an interview has on investigations, because most of you probably are having to wear both of those roles. You're having to wear those hats, right? You're not only the interviewer, but you are very likely the investigator as well. There's only a couple institutions that I work with where somebody has the ability to truly just be the interviewer and maintain that role for all of their professional responsibilities. So we do understand that even though this webinar series is focusing solely on the interview, it is important to acknowledge those effects that this process has on your investigations, and we'll be trying our best to bring that in and give you an opportunity to ask questions about that. Just as a reminder though, this is not an investigations training specifically, because we do believe very strongly that those need to be separate processes that you participate in. All right, so kicking this off, what is FETI? I just talked about that very quickly. So I'm going to put this up here in case anybody joining us hasn't seen it yet. It is science and practice-based interview methodology. We do our best to make sure that it stays informed by the current research that's available on the neurobiology of trauma and memory. And it really provides a framework for people who are interested in doing interviews, who have a responsibility for gathering information on how they can do that in a way that is actually neutral, actually equitable, and fair. So those aren't just words that sort of we say to make people feel better about their process. There's actual metrics and boundaries and guidelines within FETI to make sure that that is happening and that you can at least know what it is versus what another interviewing methodology would be. So you can see part of that framework. We covered opportunities for information in part 2 of this webinar series. We've sort of woven in the neutrality and the equity into all of our conversations about this. And then today we're going to focus on that idea that this is a continuum and it isn't just something that you do one time and then it stops. This is something that's a continuum not only for you, but also for your participants. All right, so last thing that I want to say, because we're going to be talking about this is part of the continuum, is this idea that at least within FETI, we use one methodology. So meaning we treat every participant the same. You're going to hear me referencing that. I just wanted to ground that hopefully, regardless if you're not using FETI, if you're using something else, we really do encourage you to look for opportunities to treat every participant the same. I mentioned this before, I'll say it here again. I think institutions of higher learning, my higher education sort of counterparts do a fabulous job of this. And it's because there's so much requirement. I believe, there's policy that drives the equity in this way that I don't see in some of our other professional organizations that might be outside of that. So I see that as a real benefit, and I think y'all do a really good job with that. So hopefully this methodology and the things that we're going to be talking about are already referencing things that are standard practices and part of your knowledge, skills, and abilities. One other piece that's going to be important to just remember that we already talked about is this idea of role and the importance of really understanding your role when it comes to collecting information. Sometimes I see that when we get to the place of training and we start talking about the continuum of the interview, I will see people sort of not get excited, but they might slip a little bit in their understanding of their role. They might find themselves feeling, maybe not so much overtly demonstrating or telling, but inwardly feeling like, oh, okay, here, now I get to the piece of what I need, right? And I hear this all the time from people when I'm training them, where they will be like, okay, I can do the information gathering, but when are we going to get to the part where I get to ask the question that I really want to, or the question that I need to know the answer to? So I want to pull that apart. I want to tease that apart today, because if you're feeling that, if that's a feeling that you have in your normal interview process, it really does highlight a place where you might be slipping out of that role of truly just collecting information and starting to move into a place where you're not just maintaining that role of interviewer. You are starting to do the investigation in the interview, and that can be really problematic. I would point you back to parts 1 and parts 2. If that is something that you still are wanting more information about, it can help to review that and to really be honest about what your process is in order to maintain that. So as a reminder, this for us is collecting the dots, not connecting the dots. And as we talk about the continuum today, that does not mean that when you get to sort of the end of the interview process, the end of what you view as that interview, that you start connecting those dots just because it's at the end. So when we're talking about continuum today, we mean it the entire time, that the maintaining your role, the maintaining it as an interview stays the same from the beginning, the middle, the end, and then we're going to even talk about the after the interview and maintaining your role within that as well. So I'm going to reference this. This is what we mean when we say collect the dots, not connect the dots. All right. So goal of an interview, just as a reminder, we want to provide opportunities for each participant to be able to share as much as they're able to. The reason I want to bring this back from our previous ones is because Jeff and I are going to be speaking about this quite a bit, in the idea that we get a lot of questions about, like, how do I clarify? What do I do if, information comes to me and I need to ask the person about it, but they haven't talked about it yet in their interview? Am I allowed to do that? Does that take me out of the role of interviewer and make me be in the role of investigator? These are all really important questions, and they are realistic questions that you are going to have in your process. So we're going to talk about that. And there's not a blanket right line answer that I would give you, because that's just not honest. It's not the way the process actually works. The idea really is that sometimes you're going to be sort of slipping in and out of the roles that you might have when you are more than just an interviewer in a process. As a reminder, it's not like you're outwardly telling the person that you're sitting with, okay, right now I'm an interviewer, now I'm acting as an investigator. That's not at all what I'm saying. This is a mindset for you to just, remind yourself, what is my purpose in this moment? If I am asking somebody for information about something, I need to actually give them the opportunity to share what they're able to. That's the goal of the interview. That's the goal of me in this moment. And it might be that changes rather quickly, right? And there might be a different goal. You might shift from an interview sort of situation to where you are potentially doing more of an investigation. You're trying to connect those dots together. That's an individual choice for you. What I'm just offering here is that you want to be able to at least separate those out so that you do a really good job of not getting in the way of the person actually providing you the information that you need for that investigative or other follow-on process that you might have. We're going to keep giving examples of that today, because that can be a place that, some people struggle with. As we do that, please just keep in mind that when we talk about continuum of an interview experience, we actually are meaning that for both you as the interviewer, and then also for the person who's your participant. And those sort of continuums, the pieces of this are going to be as individual as the individual that they are and that you are. We are going to give high level concepts. We're going to give general ideas. Just understand that every time we do that, it is hopefully going to be a method that you're using that adapts to the person that you're interviewing, instead of asking that, person to adapt to you or to a particular methodology that you're using. We really want to focus on, what within FETI we call like that system of security. We want to focus on those options, those opportunities for information. So just know, when we speak about this, we are talking about two different people really in this process, and we're gonna give you different options for both of those. Something else to keep in mind as we start this conversation is just this idea of what a continuum is for us. And there's lots of different definitions, but for us, when we say this, we just mean something that keeps going. It can often change, and there's a whole that's sort of made up of many parts. I try not to get too worked up and too specific about definitions, but I wanted to at least let you know, when we're using this word, it's an intentional word that we choose. And the reason is, when we first started putting the boundaries and the metrics and, these sort of guidelines for what FETI is, so I'll just use FETI as the example because that's what I use, we had to really acknowledge, well, what is an interview then? Like, when does the interview stop? When does it start? What is this process? What are these boundaries for? When are they in play? When do we not have to use them? And what's nice about all of that is it starts making you be really intentional about your process, and you really start looking at not only the words that are coming out of your mouth, but like when they're coming out of your mouth. What part of the process are you in? And it just enhances the skills that you have, because you do start being really intentional about how you're using them. So for us, and for me, I'll just say, for me, when I'm doing an interview, the interview process may and often does start like at that first contact that I have with my participant. That can be a text message that I might have. It might be that I deploy to an in-progress incident and I'm meeting them for the first time on scene somewhere. And so I don't have a lot of time with them before, and my quote unquote interview process starts just the moment I introduce myself. When I'm said, "Hi, my name is Carrie. Thank you so much for being willing to speak with me today." And then we start whatever that is for where I am in that moment. But if I have more time and it's not something that's in progress, and I have a little bit more back and forth, I'm still very aware that that information collecting sort of starts the first time they interact with me. Not necessarily because I'm asking them any question, but what I'm doing is I am setting up the interactions that I'm going to have with them. I'm giving them information on how accessible I'm going to be, how I'm going to communicate with them, and sort of I don't like to use the word expectation. I see a lot of people use expectation, but more what I'm going to offer them opportunities to do. So I try very hard not to enter into these interview continuums with expectations on my participant, because I think that raises anxiety, and it can actually diminish the opportunities for information. Instead, I'm just looking at it as this starts the moment they sort of know that I'm the one that's going to be doing the interview, and how can I be demonstrating to them that I'm going to just be really open, and I'm going to do what I can to assess their barriers and those other things we talked about in part 2 within that system of security. Now, that continuum then is going to vary, of course, include the actual interview. But what we see people miss, and what I missed very early in my career, was that it doesn't end when your interview ends, or when you think the interview ends, for you and your process, that it is this sort of process that includes many parts. And when we're really respectful and understanding of just human memory and retrieval and encoding, not that you need to be an expert in that, not that you are going to give that information to your participant, but just being aware of it from the practitioner standpoint, that this is very likely to be something that happens in stages and stops and starts. And it's a bit unrealistic to expect that somebody's going to come in and talk to you one time. They're going to get everything out that they need to, or that you need them to, for this other process that you have. And it's going to just happen in one interview and you're good. But most of our traditional systems, most of our policies, I shouldn't say most, many of them are set up with this expectation that it's not a continuum, that it is a one and done. You have one opportunity to get information from somebody, and therefore it puts a lot of pressure on you as the practitioner to cram a lot of stuff into it. And instead of it being a continuum, you're looking at it as a really short process with boundaries and with walls, and you have to just do a lot of stuff. And that's when we see these other things that we've been talking about slip away, because you have that pressure, and it is, it's pretty near impossible to be successful with that more traditional mindset. So we're going to tease that apart today. Jeff and I will give you some examples. Understanding your policy may not allow for all of this. So please just know that we're aware of that. You obviously need to follow your policy. Of course, we're not saying go against your general counsels or anything like that. We're just offering as many options as we can for you to say, what pieces of this can I take and try and sort of include or incorporate into the process that we already have, if you see value to do that. So we'll tell you what we do. We do understand that you may be limited, at least now. We do work with organizations that sort of modify or change over time, of course. So remembering that this interview process does not immediately stop, remembering that it's for both you and the participant, and then also just remembering that there is going to very likely be additional recall that happens after your interview. And that's whether you did it over the phone, whether you did a virtual interview, whether it was in person. I will say, I don't like to say always, but a lot of the time, once I started using these methods and methodologies, the participant that I interviewed would contact me and let me know that they remembered additional things. That was not happening for me when I was doing more traditional interviewing. I think there were additional reasons. Probably I wasn't doing as good a job about making sure I was accessible, or making sure the participant felt like they could call me after the fact. So that, of course, is a factor. But I also just think interviewing in a really open, trauma-informed manner, whatever that is for you, tends to allow for more recall. It just, at a very general sort of level, we find that is true. You just get more dots, right? And so if you are allowing the person to have opportunities to remember more or to share with you more, it of course makes sense that they might have those memories continue after you stop talking to them. So we're going to talk about that, like how does that impact you? How can you use that as a way to gather more dots so that you have a more effective and informed investigation or whatever process that is for you after. Just remember, as we sort of move into this, we're going to talk right now about options for closing. I want to just say from the very beginning, this is a point of the interview for you, where you as the interviewer will decide it's time to close the process. However, it may not be time for your participant to close the process. Now, the reality of just doing work is you're not going to be able to interview forever. You're not going to be able to sit there and do an interview for, as long as potentially the participant wants to, though I hope that you try if they do want to keep talking. But at some point, realistically, you do need to close it out. Please just keep in mind, because you are closing it, your participant oftentimes will sort of either remember something at that point, or there will be new information that comes in. And I want to just highlight here, even though I'm saying you're closing the interview, if new information comes up, even in your closing, we really encourage you to lean back into that process, go back in and do the tell me more about, or start, collecting that new information. And this is a really key piece of the continuum, understanding that that information can really pop up or come up or sort of be shared at any point. When I was doing more of the traditional, I didn't see this happening as much. And I really strongly believe, especially in watching teams that still do quite a bit of traditional interviewing, you give a lot of cues, both verbally and non-verbally, to your participant when you're closing your interview. And even if they are remembering something new, or maybe they just got to a point where they're willing and able to share it and they weren't earlier, if you aren't still open, if you still aren't projecting that you have genuine curiosity about the information and that you are still open to receiving it, even in your closing process, that participant may choose to keep it to themselves. And of course, that's not what you want to have happen. If your whole goal is to collect and properly document anything that that person is able to share, you want that to be true the entire time, the entire continuum, the before, the during, and the after for them. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this closing. That mindset is really critical, and sort of the persona that you have is critical at the end, just like it would be at the beginning and during. Also, some people will tell me when I am working with them in their teams that, Carrie, this is all well and good, but I only get one segment of time for my interview with this person. And I acknowledge that. I'm not at all telling you that that's not true for some organizations or some interviewers. I think it's incredibly unfortunate. I think it's a very traditional organizational mindset that they have put on the people working in their institutions. But I acknowledge that some of you have to work with that. So you may have to structure your interview different than how Jeff and I are encouraging you to do that. So I do know, just try and look for some opportunities if you can, even if it's a very short amount of time, to open where you can, to give a little bit more time where you can. I will say in those instances, I believe it's even more important than, even though I think it's important no matter what, but it's even more important to really practice really good, open-ended, unidirectional interviewing. Because if you have a sort of one time to talk to them and a very limited amount of time to do it, it is so critical that you're not the one taking up that space, that you aren't filling that very limited time that you have with your own opinions or thoughts or just words. It's really critical that you're giving that time over to your participant, even more when you have the limited amounts of time. So I get concerned when, I'll hear interviewers or teams sort of start putting up all the but I can't, or well, that sounds great, but and they sort of have a reason it won't work, because that is definitely a red flag to me when I'm working with a team, that instead of looking for opportunities to just enhance even a small amount of time, they're just sort of throwing up their hands saying it's not worth trying at all because we don't have this more perfect situation. So be careful. I throw that out because I do see that mindset, and that mindset gets in the way of the opportunities for information during the entire continuum, sometimes more than almost anything that you're going to participate in. Now, when I talk about this, I do think it's really important to remind yourself about role here. The reason I bring this up in the specific closing section is because it's where I see the slip happen the most, when people start sort of separating themselves from interviewer. And this might be where they start giving an opinion. It's where advice tends to come in. If I haven't seen it in the rest of the interview process and the other parts of the interview, I tend to see it here with some interviewers where they will sort of feel like they can do it more at the end, or it's not as harmful because they waited until the end. Just want to draw a very clear line for us, for me in particular, giving an opinion or giving advice at any time during an interview, whether it's the beginning, the middle, after the interview, I find it incredibly damaging and really problematic for being able to gather information, just because, again, we talked about this in the other ones, but you don't know how the words that you're going to say are going to truly impact or resonate with the person that you're speaking with. And so you don't want to take the chance of doing something that's going to shut them down or make them less likely to share or talk to you, of course, right? So remember that that is just as harmful at the end as it is at the beginning or during the interview. Now, I say role here because if your role at the end of this process is not just to collect the dots. So for instance, we have people who are clinicians. We have people who their role during some part of the time with the participant is to actually do something other than just collect. Maybe they do need to connect the dots for something. Maybe their role is to give advice, or their role is to provide some other information that is different. Just know at that point, we'd say you're shifting from an interview to this other process, and that's totally fine. I think all the time about prosecutors or the people that I work with within offices of prosecution. They will often use a really good trauma-informed methodology. Some of them use FETI, and they will do that during the information collection piece of it, reminding themselves to truly, allow the person to share. And then at some point of their interaction, they do need to give information over to the participant. I know this is also true for some of you within the higher education environment, within the Title IX, the investigative process for sure, but also you have rights and accommodations, you have, some requirements of policy and information to be given at very specific times. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You are in a different process at that point. You are not in an information collection process at that point. So be careful not to conflate those two. Those are different processes. I think there's still ways that you can bring in really good trauma-informed concepts to those. We'd encourage you to do that. I still think it's great to be asking for permission before you give information, all of the things that we already talked about. Just understand that it's still incredibly important to differentiate just in your mind, not outwardly, what is my actual role, what's my purpose in this moment, and rarely is it going to be to give advice or opinions. Now, on that same sort of spectrum, you have this idea of, am I in the interview versus am I in the investigation? I just want to bring this in, and I know Jeff has some thoughts about this too, because this tends to happen, and I mentioned this already, when people say, okay, now is the time I get to clarify. So I want to just pause here and spend some time talking about clarifying. I don't use that language personally, but I know many people do. I used to use it all the time. I mean, Jeff has taught with me for so long, and he's sort of seen the spectrum of my growth as an interviewer and then separately as an investigator. And I used to put these two together. I did not separate them. I mean, we did trainings where they were very much, taught in the same fashion, and there was no separation between it. What I've learned, and what, as my skill set has improved, I've seen how important it is to separate these out. And I just want to be clear that this continuum that we're talking about today, this is true the entire time. So if I were to get to the end of an interview, or let's say it's my second or my third interview with somebody, for whatever reason that needed to happen in this larger process that I'm involved in, I'm still using the exact same things that we've talked about. I am still making sure that I'm employing unidirectional interviewing. I'm making sure that even if I am clarifying information, I'm looking for opportunities to be open about it versus more direct, right? Versus trying to connect the dots, if you will, which is the investigation, versus collecting them, which is the interview. So I'll just give you a quick example that I see I mean, it comes up most investigations, and it's this idea of like text messages or some sort of chat history or some sort of social media interaction that maybe didn't come up in the interview in the collecting piece, and maybe we have that subsequently from another interview. And there's this idea, well, I need to clarify. I hear that a lot, Carrie. I need to clarify about these text messages or whatever it is, and I need to ask this person about it. I want to be incredibly clear. Yes, you do. And we would never not want you to gather information or dots about that potential piece of information, evidence, whatever you want to designate it as. We actually think it's particularly problematic if you don't give a person an opportunity to provide any information that they have, or even, in some instances, it might be helpful to get their perspective on something, right? But what I'm being careful to say there is that it's their perspective, it's their information if they have it. So I'm not going in with the idea to clarify. And the reason I don't like that word anymore, and I try not to use it, is because it sort of connotates, especially if you say it to the participant, that there was something wrong originally with what they said, or that they should have said something. Now, I know that's not probably how people are intending it, because if you look up the definition of that, that's not what it is. But sometimes the words that we use, they just not only put you in a mindset that doesn't encourage just collecting, it also can sort of either increase the anxiety on the participant or make it so that they feel judged or they feel like they did something wrong, which you just don't want to do. I mean, strategically, that's not going to be helpful for you as an interviewer. So I try just to give opportunities. I lean on that. I try to just say things like, would it be okay if we talked again if new information came up and I just wanted to hear your thoughts about it? It's not uncommon for me to say something like that to somebody after we end an interview. I don't say it every time, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And then, if I do need to call the person up or encourage them to come in and see if they'd be willing to talk to me again, I would just give them opportunities. I would look for open-ended ways that I could get information about what potentially they either encoded in their own individual memory or information that they had that they might have learned from somebody else. So if it was specifically about text messages, I would take the ownership, the responsibility as the interviewer to try not to provide the information in a way that was leading or could edit the participant's memory. So for instance, I would not go into the room with the text messages, put them down on the table and say, what are you able to tell me about these text messages? Now, you might in your process get to a place where you choose to show the text messages. Nothing wrong with that, right? You have to make that individual decision. I personally wouldn't do that initially because I know that there are ways that I can put that on myself to give those same opportunities. And it is going to be a less leading way, meaning that if I get information about the text messages without having to show them, it is oftentimes better for whoever is a finder of fact or some sort of decision-making capacity to say, oh, well, this person independently recalled that, or, whatever weight they want to give to it for some sort of decision. That might be more meaningful if the information didn't come from me, it came independently from the participant. So you just need to sort of decide on your own how you want to do that. My recommendation is to do it at the end if you can. So the way that this would look for me is that I might sit down if, let's say again, text messages came up. And I might, if I didn't ask this in a previous interview, say, help me understand how you communicated with this person. Again, as open-ended as you can, just sort of seeing that the nice thing is you might get the information about the text messages, but you might also get other communications that you don't even know about. So this is going back to the opportunities for information, casting that wider net, if you will, to sort of get the dots than just this very specific lure. If we're going to use the fishing for information analogy, there's nothing wrong with being, more specific and casting a very specific lure in a very specific direction for this thing. But if you cast the wider net, if you go more open, you might not only get the thing that you are hoping to get what you would call clarification about, but you might gather these other things that you never would have known to ask about. So that's great. That's opportunities for information. That's understanding and being really respectful of not only just humans, but the way the brain can encode and retrieve information. So If they weren't going there, if they weren't saying anything, and maybe it's because they don't remember, maybe it's because they don't want to talk to you about it. All of those things have to be options, right? Because it's not your job during that collection sort of phase to make a decision or a guess or an assumption about why they don't remember. You're just giving them opportunities. Now, I definitely see that there could be a situation where you need to show the text messages to them. Again, just looking for opportunities to minimize the way that might edit their memory. I see this done different ways. There's different styles of interviews. If I find myself in a position doing that, and I will tell you it's fairly rare, but we do have it happen, I might just ask for permission, say, so there's information that I received about some text messages. Would it be okay if I went through those with you? If the person says no to me, which very rarely happens, but if they did, then I would just say, tell me more about not wanting to go through them. Because there's obviously something there, there's a barrier, or there's some other information that we need to sort of learn about and be able to document in our process. If they said yes, which again, most people do, then I think it's fine to just be as open-ended as possible. Usually I'll say, what, if anything, are you able to tell me about these? Or help me understand your thoughts about these? And then really importantly, I stop talking. I shut my mouth. I make sure just to allow the person to on their own sort of interact with the information. And I observe that, I cue to it. I might do more tell me mores, help me understand your thoughts about that. And I try very, very hard not to lead and not to put any of my opinions. There's no confrontation about it. I'm really just continuing to try and gather. And then I'm being really careful that, and this is the difference between the clarifying and the interview versus investigation piece. I am being really honest when I document my time with them, my interview with them, as to when I introduce that information, so that it's very fair to the participant. This is when potentially they learned about this, and they might have learned about it from me, and they might have had no independent recollection about it until it was, me introducing it. And that's fine. That's an accurate representation then at that point. And at least, the participant isn't being held sort of quote unquote responsible for something that they didn't do. You were the one as the interviewer who introduced the information into that part of the process. Jeff, I know you have thoughts on this. What would you like?
So thank you, Carrie. This is just, I just want to maybe summarize for myself, think out loud a little bit in a way that I hope is helpful to our participants today, about what you've been saying around using language like interviewing for clarification versus providing an opportunity to provide perspective or information. And I think as a matter of shorthand, I in the past most definitely have used interview for clarification, and you'll see that in the publications I cited at the beginning. But what I hear you saying, and you can let me know if this is not accurate, is you are very much encouraging and understanding that we need to give all participants opportunities to talk about information that we've received throughout our other interviews around text messages or other communications with other folks and those sorts of things, that frankly, they deserve the opportunity to comment on those things, but we want to continue to do it in a way that keeps the focus on their experience, what they're able to recall, not the investigators, and I use that advisedly, or the interviewers' agenda. And so being as open-ended as possible as we bring these things forward in the way that you're talking about. If we've thought in the past about using interview for clarification, and I'll probably use it in the future, I have no doubt that I will do that, but I will try and shift over to the language of providing opportunities for providing perspective or what have you. But as long as we recognize the difference between mindset and not letting shorthand for something like interview for clarification undermine our mindset of always staying in the interviewer role when working with witnesses in the context you've talked about so far, that we're going to be okay. So I just wanted to sort of ask what you thought of that, and put that in the context of what we're likely to be doing in the field in these investigations and interviews.
Yeah, I love it too, because it really highlights the difference between interview and investigation. So when I'm in my sort of, and please, to everybody sort of that's listening to this, the hard part is remembering that what we're talking about is enhancing knowledge, skills, and abilities. We're talking about training, right? And like skill set and being able to really be an adept, and like a good practitioner. These aren't things that you're saying to your participant out loud. These aren't things that you are or should ever be, informing your participant about. They aren't there sharing information with you to learn how you learn to do that. And sometimes people confuse that. I will see people start trying to explain why they're doing something to their participant instead of just doing a really good interview. So I love that clarification, Jeff, because it is part of your investigative process, 100%. I mean, I clarify all sorts of stuff when I have my investigator quote unquote hat on. And so this is 100% what you just said. It's mindset. I've tried really hard to get myself sort of out of my own way and to be able to really like stop myself from interrupting, stop myself from doing things. I'm thinking of like some of my older interviews where I would do things like, but what about, I'm sure if some of you looked back at your interviews, you would probably see that sometimes. And that's because you're trying to clarify, or you're trying to make sense of. Some of this is just semantics and words, right? Which is fine, but they inform our mindset. And so what it has helped me do is go, yeah, I have to clarify. I need to connect the dots. I need to do all that in my investigation. But in order to get the things that I need in my investigation to corroborate or refute or just frankly look further into, I have to remind myself that when I go and ask for the dots that I need to clarify, because the clarification onus is on me. And what's so interesting when we really started to dissect the interviewing process, and we spent, years and years dissecting, like, what does it mean to do a traditional interviewing? What does that actually mean? Too often what I was doing, and this is not a critique just generally, I mean, I'm critiquing myself. Too often what I was doing was I was actually asking my participants sort of unknowingly to me to do my investigation for me, right? So like the expectation was I'm going to them, even if it's just a phone call, and I'm using this clarification piece of saying things to them like, what about, but what about this? And what you really saw me doing was trying to have that participant solve, quote unquote, the case for me or the investigation for me. Instead of, now my mindset is, I'm going to go to this person, try and get more of the info, more of the dots, and then I take it back into my investigation, and I'm the one who is now clarifying, right? I'm the one who's using the information from them to do the clarification that's part of the investigation, and 100% it's necessary. But I'm not asking them to do it. Their whole role in any process that I have, at least for my instance, is to provide me with what information about what they're able to remember. And that could be, information they have that they witnessed, that somebody told them. They might just be an outcry witness. It might have been something they heard. All of that is then what I take to clarify any questions that I have left in my investigation. But I am really taking that responsibility on for me. So I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with clarifying or any of the language that's done, because that's very much the investigation and that should still be there. And if anybody's not doing that, then I think you actually are not upholding the responsibility of your professional role to do an investigation. It's just really separating out those two processes again. It's why, and it takes some time. This took me years to be able to really understand the mindset. And I pushed back on it a lot. I pushed back on it sort of saying, well, it's not that important, or I can do that at the same time. Like I'm able to do it at the same time. But what you can really see, especially just with my interviews, is you would see that, but what about, or, well, do you think, you might have done X? And that's an opinion. That was me inserting an opinion. That was me inserting an assumption. That was me trying to have that person guess as to what their actions were about, which honestly, in the end, it just made my investigation so much more complicated than if I had just focused on collecting and keeping those processes, at least mindset wise, very separate. Does that clarify that, or can I provide more on that, Jeff?
That does definitely clarify. Thanks very much, Carrie.
Awesome. Love it. Okay. So, and I see that some questions are coming in. So please let your questions keep coming. I definitely know This, and Jeff and I do this all the time, so we know that this can poke at some current process that people have. And I say that again because it definitely poked at my process when I first started doing this. So I wouldn't be recommending it if I didn't see that it really helped me be able to actually get more stuff. I think this is strategically in your best interest, but it can definitely be a departure from what you might be currently doing. So we understand some of it might be a slow incorporation if you are looking to add any pieces to your process that we're talking about. Here's just some options for closing that I wanted to put up here. Again, this recording will be available, so please don't worry if I go through these and you're not able to write them down if you want to. This is something that I say during my closing, my quote unquote closing portion of all of my interviews. But I just also want to mention this is something that you're going to hear me say at the beginning. So this is back to interview being a continuum and trying not to go in and have it be so regimented that you have this process that everybody else is fitting into. And it's just, it's what you become comfortable with and it's your routine. I really sort of cringe when I hear people say that they have a routine, because oftentimes that is not being really respectful of the participant. And you're asking them to mold to you versus you molding to them. So I say that I will often use this in closing, but it is totally fine to be using this as other parts of the process as well. I also just want to remind you that when we say things like this, thank you for being willing to share this with me today. I appreciated it, or I really appreciate it. For me, it's important that this is genuine, that this isn't just, again, a memorized statement. I think your interviewer persona, the genuine empathy that you have, or the genuine appreciation that you have is very helpful here, and that participants are going to feel that. Now, remember, this is one methodology for everybody. So this is true with my victims, respondents, complainants, suspects, witnesses, whatever sort of professional language you want to use. I'm doing this consistently, and I do mean it, even to people that maybe, it's not somebody I would want to hang out with. Maybe it's somebody that has done something objectionably, problematic. I still am very appreciative if they're willing to talk to me. So this is very helpful. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is when you say something like this, you are indicating oftentimes to the participant that you're getting to the closing portion, which, just as a reminder, a lot of times this will be when new information shows up. I don't have any research to back this up. This is all anecdotal for me, but I see it so consistently that my feeling is sometimes people might have information that they really do remember, and they're sort of, I hate to use the word struggling, but they might just be undecided on whether or not to share it with you. And, when they start feeling you close down that interview, it might be when they're like, okay, I'm going to talk about this. So just as a reminder, you may be closing, but it may be the opening for your participant, and this may go much longer than you initially closing it. I tend to demonstrate, though, that the interview is coming to a close with this statement. You would see this very consistently in the interviews that you saw me doing today. So a couple other options, open-ended options that seem to be routinely used. Help me understand anything we haven't been able to talk about yet that you would like to share. Now, I'm putting these in here because I'm giving you this, and then I'll give you in a minute another open-ended option. And it's because both myself and a lot of other people for so many years used a very specific closed option to this. And it's speaks to the brain very differently when you try and avoid the yes/no questions, even at the end of your process or the beginning of your process. So I wanted to give you very specific ways to keep this still open-ended. You can see that this question, or this, well, I would say it's not a question here, right? To me, it's a prompt. It's an allowing, it's sort of like a cue, allowing them to provide information if they want to, but just, note here that it's, help me understand anything we haven't been able to talk about yet that you would like to share. And this lets them go wherever they want to go. Sometimes it's relevant to the quote unquote what you need, and sometimes it's not. And so you're going to just decide at that point whether you want to follow up on it, whether you want to do a tell me more about, or allow more space for that, or if you want to continue closing down the interview. That is just your individual choice as the interviewer, and you would make that determination based on what's happening in that interview, based on the information they're sharing. What I would hesitate and sort of encourage you to avoid is saying things like, help me understand anything that you haven't shared that you believe is important to my investigation. Now, I'm saying this one because I see it a lot. I definitely used to use it. It was taught to me. I try not to do that now because what you're asking them to do is guess at what's important to you, which, I mean, I see too often that maybe there was something they might have said, but they're internally going, oh yeah, it's probably not important to their investigation, so I'm just going to leave that out. Now, I'm greedy. I'm, as one of our fellow instructors would say, an information goblin. Like, we want all of it. Give me all the information, right? Let me determine if it's important or needed later, but I just want to be greedy and I want all the information. So I don't want to encourage or offer opportunities for somebody to decide what that is. I just want to continue communicating whatever you're able to remember, whatever you're able to share. I'm here to hear it. I'm here to take it in, and I'm here to document it and make sure that it's preserved later. So this type of statement can be really helpful for that. Another option, what, if anything, would you like to tell me that I haven't yet asked you about? So these are both really open-ended options. Either one of those, I try really hard to do this. Sometimes, my traditional training, because I've, had so much of it, and I've done more years traditionally interviewing than I have doing interviewing the way that we're talking about now, I will slip up and you will hear me say something like this, which I don't think it's harmful. I just wanted to point out it's not as good. So is there anything that we haven't been able to talk about, or that I haven't asked you a question about, that you would like to be able to share? Wanted to put this up here because a couple things with this. One, it's a yes, no question. So oftentimes you're going to get exactly what you asked for. You're going to get a yes or a no, and it costs you the same amount of time to ask this exact thing in a more open way. That's going to encourage more of that narrative flow than versus just a yes, no. Also note, this is a pretty complex question. It's definitely a compound question. I have a lot of stuff in here. And so, this is probably the one that I see the most. And it's definitely the one I still do sometimes without realizing it. And I'm really trying to do it the other way that we just talked about. So wanted to give you all these options. I don't think you're going to cause harm, of course, with this specific question you're looking at now, but it is important to be really intentional, or at least look for opportunities to be intentional about being more open-ended. Strategically, it's just going to get you more information. So another option for you as you're closing that I love is this idea of asking how somebody is feeling in the moment. I don't use this 100% of the time, though it's probably pretty close. So I just wanted to offer this up. This has been a nice way of sort of indicating the continuum to my participant without educating them on the process unnecessarily. And it also can get you really important information for your actual later process, like an investigation. It can also be a nice way of both indicating that the interview is coming to a close and identifying if they do have a need, like a physical need in the moment. It can help bring people back into the present, depending on how much information they were sharing. We don't encourage you to make assumptions about whether something is stressful, traumatic, or impactful. That is definitely not your role, or probably not your role, depending on your clinical licensure and things like that. For most interviewers, it's very hazardous to make that determination. However, if somebody is sharing something that they have identified was impactful, traumatic, or stressful for them, it can be nice to just have a little bit of a breather, especially at the end of this process where they might be sharing that with you, instead of what sometimes I see, which is that you're done and the process is done. And even if you're being nice, it's done. And they're sort of like very quickly, it almost feels like just kicked out of the room or kicked out of the process. So in order to minimize that feeling, I like this cue. I like spending some time, help me understand how you're feeling right now. You may not feel it's appropriate to ask this, and that's just individually up to you. I have not received negative participant feedback from this because it is very open and they can sort of choose where they want to go with it. I have some people who are like, yeah, I'm fine. This is not a problem or whatever, and They choose not to sort of engage with the question, and that's great because they have the option to do that. And I have other participants that, will talk about how their body feels in the moment. I have participants that will start talking about how they're feeling physically. Some will talk about how they're feeling emotionally. It really allows people the ability to choose the information that they want to share. And sometimes them talking about either the physical or the sort of emotional, whatever that is, that feeling, sometimes I have found that's the springboard to even new information coming up. It might be at that point, something that might have been like implicit becomes explicit for a memory. And that happens at the end, just based on this cue. This is also a cue you could use at other parts of the interview, though I try to not interrupt the retrieval process if I can. So that this might be something that I start out an interview with. I mentioned this earlier in our other sections. It can be helpful to identify a barrier that somebody might have that they haven't shared with you or that hasn't been identified yet. But it can also be a good way of like wrapping up and assessing a need. So one thing on this just to keep in mind is that if you say things like this, if you're asking how somebody's feeling, this is when it can be particularly important and I think professionally responsible to make sure and know what your resource options are. So for me, when I'm in the role of interviewer, I am not in the role of advocate. I am not in the role of, some other sort of professional role where I am going to be the person that provides them with resources, especially if I'm brought in by an organization to conduct the interview. I'm oftentimes out, right? Like I'm leaving after that interview and I won't even be available to them later. So I have to be really, really careful that if I'm going to be in these situations, I try to know what the resources are or who I can connect them with for accommodations, resources, things like that. My guess is most of you who are listening to this is just part of your process already. You have some policy requirements about this. I just wanted to highlight and indicate how incredibly important it is, but also not to step outside of your role unless it is also your role to do that, to offer those services. You probably are just informing based off of somebody opting into that. So again, not just having it be a routine or a part of your process that everybody gets unless you're driven by policy on that, but to ask for permission. What if any information could I provide you about resources? It can be just as simple as that. And then of course, hopefully you have the information if you're going to offer that as an option. This is another sort of in your closing section, another option that you could have. Do you have any questions for me? This seems like a really simple, basic thing that everybody would ask, but I just find people miss it. So I try and incorporate that. I try and do that at the beginning if it seems appropriate, but also at the end, do you have any questions for me? Rather than just sort of, spewing out the information that I'm assuming that they want. Help me understand any questions you have for me. If you want to make it less of a yes, no question, that's an option there for you as well. I will often also just conclude at the very, very end, again, just appreciation. Thank you so much for being willing to come in today. After it's completely over, after the interview is like, I'm done, there's no information collection happening, I think it's fine if you want to engage in conversation. We sort of remind people in our Fetty trainings, try not to become robotic. You still want to be human. You still want to be, encouraging that connectivity. This is the continuum piece. Keep in mind that the things that you do, the interactions you have, especially if they're in person, though it can still, you can still do some of this virtually or over the phone, but they are paying attention to you the entire time. Very likely. So, if you sort of end the interview and that collection process and all of a sudden you turn into a different person, that's probably strategically not going to be helpful or encouraging for them to come back to you if they remember something new, which would be a strategic goal that you probably would have, right? You want them to come back if they remember something later. So one of the things that I used to do, not as relevant in higher education, but just to highlight this point, if when I was a detective, bringing somebody in and doing, quote unquote, suspect interview, I would not, even if I was going to arrest the person, and it was my case, it was, my arrest, I very strategically was not the person who put handcuffs on them. I would ask one of my fellow officers to be the one that came in and actually did the physical custodial arrest. And that was because I just wanted to maintain my role of information collector, my role of accessibility to this person, should they want to provide me information later. So there's just different things like that. I mean, you might have places in your procedures and your policies, especially if you have like administrative duties or something that could be perceived as punitive, anything like that. If you have coworkers or colleagues that can do some of those actions, if you have been in the role, sort of assigned to the role of information collector, you just might look for opportunities like that. Can I have somebody else do this one piece that might be really small or short or not take a lot of time? And it lets me maintain more of the information collector accessible role should this person want to come in and provide additional information. So not a requirement, just a strategy that you might want to look for opportunities to do. And then, again, trying to maintain that humanity, trying to make sure, just understand, because the sort of interview has come to a conclusion for you, it's probably not come to a conclusion for whomever you've been talking to. They are very likely going to be walking either out of that or leaving this virtual environment and continuing to think about whatever the experience was that you were interviewing them about. Even if it's somebody who just witnessed something, I mean, I don't want to minimize all of that, even if it's somebody who you might be making assumptions about that it wasn't that big of a deal for them. I hear that quite a bit. We hear from participants that getting questioned about something, being involved in an interview process, like most of you are facilitating, can be very anxiety inducing and stressful. So they are probably leaving that. You might be moving on and doing something else because it's just part of your workday. But for them, that continuum is often ongoing. Not 100%, everybody is different, but being really respectful about that. So you may, and again, do not educate. I'd never encourage people to educate on the neuroscience to a participant. But what I might say is something very generic, like, sometimes I hear that people remember information after they stop talking to me or after they leave the interview. I just want you to know that if that happens, it's completely up to you. But, you're welcome to contact me and let me know that. And we could, make a decision together as to whether you wanted to come in and share more information. That's an option for you. Sometimes I don't say that because I might genuinely not have that as an option. I might not be able to do that because I might not be there, but I would still say something similar and say, here's the person you could contact if that happens. And so I'm encouraging that continuum. I'm being respectful that this isn't just a one and done interview, unless that really is all you have to offer. And then, of course, you need to do what you need to do for your policy. I would still probably be trying to provide information to my participant that this was the only opportunity they had to give information. I wouldn't want to hide that if I was truly limited in my policies and procedures for that. What I do find, though, when people tell me that, is that tends not to be an actual policy. It tends more to be a traditional practice. So probably just want to look for that as well. So lastly, in this sort of wrapping up piece of, what do we want you to be thinking about in ending the interview, is this idea of like biographical information and contact information. I just want to quickly mention that some people have a really clear routine of doing this at the beginning of their interview. It used to be sitting down and, like, honestly, not even really looking at the person, just having my paper in front of me, having maybe my report face sheet, and I'm filling stuff out. I'll observe teams and they like pull out their laptop or they pull out their computer, sit behind a desk, and they're just literally asking the person across from them this biographical or contact information and just filling in the blanks, literally. Now, some of you, this is sounding very familiar to right now, and it's because I see this a lot. So I know this is a process many people do. What we have found is this feels pretty sterile. We get feedback from participants that this feels like going to the doctor's office, and it's always, not always, often something that people talk about being really put off by, like even when they're talking to a medical professional or a doctor and they're doing this, it just makes you feel like a cog in a wheel versus a human. So I would just offer to you in this continuum, look for opportunities to humanize this, to also be a bit more strategic about when you ask for it. For me, I really have pushed any of the biographical or the contact questions to the end of the interview versus the beginning. And it's honestly, because I find that I get more accurate information. Most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, the person is significantly more comfortable with me after they have gone through the interview. Now, that wasn't necessarily true when I was doing traditional interviewing, but with these more open methodologies, I find this to be true. And it's been interesting because I was hearing things like, let me give you a different phone number at the end versus the phone number they gave me at the beginning. Or, oh, actually, I do have a different social media handle or something like that. So because that was happening enough, I've just really moved this process to the end. I'm not saying you can't do it at the beginning, especially if you have a policy requirement about it. But even at the beginning, I try and humanize it. I don't put myself behind a computer. I don't encourage that. Hopefully I am educated enough to know the information that I need. And if I, for whatever reason, need to gather it, I'll try and be as open-ended as I can. Help me understand the name you would like me to, put you down with in the report. Things like that, right? Just make it more of less of a procedure, more of, even if you want to call it a conversation at that point, because this is more just biographical, that's fine. But consider moving it to the end, because I actually think strategically you'll find that it's more helpful if you're not already doing that. And I do think it's also fairly unlikely that your interview participant is just going to get up and run out of the room. I mean, we've had it happen. It's incredibly rare, but it does happen. And oftentimes we still knew enough about them to be able to get the biographical information that we've had. So, sometimes people will push back and say, I have to get it in the beginning because something could go wrong. I mean, again, you got to do you, but I find that often that it's more of an excuse and less sort of understanding about what might be more strategically helpful. So happy to answer more questions about that. Just wanted to make sure to at least talk about that as an option. And then sort of before we move on, this idea about keeping, maintenance of your role, maintaining what your role actually is. And the reason I say this is really because I find that people promise things that they just are not going to do. Now, if you are really going to follow through with something, then there's nothing wrong with saying it. But I also think you have to at least put some thought into what are you really there for? And what are you going to be there for realistically for this person? So the way I hear this when it goes not so great is, call me anytime. Or I will hear interviewers say, that they're available by email, like, send me this and I'll get right back to you. And we have, some, I'm thinking of some of our even advanced interviewers that we've had to really work with because the intention was really good. The intention often is, I want to help this person, or I want to be available. And you can kind of get caught up in the moment as the interviewer sometimes, especially if you really have had a genuine connection and you've been doing a really good job of extending in empathy and really, learning about this experience. You're human too. And so you sometimes can get a bit caught up in it. This is just a reminder about the professional role that you want to acknowledge just internally to yourself, and not promise something that you have no intention or maybe aren't even allowed to follow through on. When you don't do this, it can be misleading. I hate to use the word harmful, but I mean, this is really the moments where I have seen participants talk to us, provide information to us when we're evaluating sort of the process that organizations use. And this is where I hear people say, when they felt bad or when they were upset about something, it tends to be because the interviewer, who is often also the investigator, sort of promised that they would be available and they weren't, promised they would pick up the phone and they didn't, promised they would provide updates on the investigation or the case and they didn't. So just be really careful. I just wanted to throw this in there. This is definitely something that impacts the continuum. And we do encourage you to if you're able to do check-ins, not check-ins to necessarily see how somebody is, because that's probably not your professional role. That would be more somebody else potentially within your team or your community partners, but more to say something, like, I'm just checking in. What, if anything, would you like to share with me since we last had a chance to talk? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's great. If you're able to do that, that is absolutely respectful of the continuum and the fact that people might remember new information and maybe, just didn't have a chance to call you. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But again, I really encourage people not to promise it, because we are all busy. And I know most of you are busy and stuff just comes up, and it can be really, really hard for your participants to not have that follow through. Before I move on to documentation, Jeff, did you have anything on the concluding the interview piece?
Not really, beyond just noting that it's very, very common. You were talking at the beginning about maybe having rules about how many times you could interview people and that sort of thing. And we did tend to hear some of that in the higher ed world. Maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, there's some language around at least multiple interviews of complainants in New York's enough is enough law, trying to basically discourage that. But in general, there is a much higher tolerance, I think, for the idea that we are going to have to speak with folks more than once. And we want to be very careful when we close, let's say, an initial interview, to make sure we emphasize that it is highly likely, it's likely that I'm going to want to speak with you again. I thank you so much for taking the time you've been able to give me today. It's likely I'm going to reach out again. I hope it's okay that I do that, because I'm probably going to want to give you the opportunity to share information about things that I learned from other people, or maybe just look in more detail at things you've provided me and ask you questions about your perspective on those things. And then be careful when you get to those second interviews or third interviews, if necessary, to limit your inquiry to those and make sure you're not asking people to provide information repetitively, because that's what we really do want to avoid. We are going to have to go back and provide opportunities to share additional information, particularly about things that are new to us, but we don't want to have people repeating an account that they've provided already, because that's, I think, where we get into the trouble of people feeling like they're not being heard the first time. This is unnecessarily difficult for me, for either party, that sort of thing. But you need to be thoughtful of that dynamic, and make sure that you close your interviews in a way that anticipates follow-up, but also don't be, in my view, don't be shy about the need to follow up and provide that opportunity for further information sharing, because it is really going to have to be part of what you do in collecting as many dots as you can in order to do a good investigation.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. And I sort of always hesitate to say what's the typical, amount of interviews that I do in an investigation, but I get that question a lot. I mean, there just is no typical, but I would say if I'm going to average just on what Jeff is saying, it's really rare that I just do one interview with one person. I do think there tends to be a more in-depth interview, maybe a longer interview with somebody, depending on what part of the experience, they're giving information on. But if you're really thorough in your investigative practices, most often you're going to have to talk to them again. So I really echo everything that Jeff said. It's really important, and it's part of the continuum that we're talking about that I just think traditionally got lost. It was this idea of one and done. I agree there was some older training that sort of dissuaded people from doing follow-on interviews or follow-up interviews. I like, as you can tell, I just like to view them as interviews because it's just a continuum of it. But I think that if you were exposed to that type of training, at least my perception is that was trying to minimize harm from just bad interviewing practices, right? So sometimes what people found themselves doing was trying to minimize the fact that people didn't have a skill set to interview in the first place. And so you got these sort of downstream responses that we're trying to fix or mitigate harm, instead of just fixing the upstream problem was that the person wasn't skilled at interviewing. So just wanted to throw that out there. That could be something that might be a little confusing if you had some older training about that. I think if you are employing really good trauma-informed principles, open-ended questions, not interrupting, really basic stuff like that, you are minimizing the need for a lot of that, particularly if you are doing an additional interview, a follow-on interview, whatever you want to call that. It's not that you're going back and asking them, tell me, what are you able to tell me about your experience, and like asking them to tell you from the whole thing again. That person is really able to choose the information. We would never encourage people to go back and interview, and I've heard this from people, again, pretty outdated traditional techniques, but for some people, it's what they bring into, especially the higher ed environments. If you have them coming from a really traditional law enforcement background or a really traditional prosecutorial background, on retiring and coming into these higher ed environments, which we see quite often, they might have incredibly outdated training. And so, it is worth mentioning that even if you're not currently doing this, it might be a process of somebody who is with you in your organization, or somebody, this participant that's in front of you at the moment, has experienced in another interview with them, be it maybe a different community partner that had interaction with them or something like that. So, you do not want to interview for consistency. That's the kindest way I can say that. That's an interrogation tactic that we would never be in support of. It's definitely not neutral, definitely not equitable, definitely not fair and impartial. So, you would be missing quite a bit of what I believe are great requirements within the higher ed context of Title IX investigation. So hopefully nobody's doing that. When we say to leave it open to sort of new information, or, again, to clarify information, understanding that that's on you, not the participant, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but we're not looking to interview for consistency. We are looking to collect the information, and then it's on you to corroborate, refute, or gather more information. It's not on that participant to be consistent. And again, Jeff and I are happy to jump into the reasons why on that. If we need to go more into that, please feel free to put a question in. Okay, I am going to, just because I'm looking at the time and I know we wanted to leave time for questions, I'm going to just switch to documentation. And as I head into documentation, I completely know that I'm going to light some people on fire with this. So that I'm not trying to do that on purpose. I just really want to be clear from the beginning that I do understand some of what I'm going to talk about might not be possible currently in the organization that you are at. Now, I have just made the determination, we collectively have made the determination that even though that is true, we still think that there is a responsibility to be really honest about what documentation should be. And that the goal is to head in that direction, because there really is, at least that we've been able to tell, and we're open to anybody else's ideas. If you can tell me something differently, there really is only one way to accurately document what somebody has told you. Now, I say that and knowing that a lot of the organizations that I work with just don't have the actual capacity to do this. So for instance, like right now we're looking, some people are writing their reports, some people are videotaping, some people are just typing them, on a computer. I see just such a wide variety of documentation styles, probably more documentation styles than I see interview styles of all the organizations I work with. And this is worldwide. I see this very, very consistently. Though I will say, even though this is shifting a little bit, I would say higher education, at least within the United States, tends to be the furthest behind of other professions on documenting interviews. And again, I know that there's individual organizations that just do more of what we're going to talk about. So I'm not saying this to make anybody feel bad. I just really want to highlight the importance of being honest about our process, because when we're not, what I've seen happen, and I'm sure some of you have seen happen, is that the participant who initially shared the information is held accountable for incorrect documentation. And that is incredibly harmful, not only for them, but for your other processes, for the finder of fact, for whoever is going to be making that determination. The interview really needs to be properly documented. So that's my preface. I'm going to go through what that means to us, what that means specifically to me as an advanced interviewer with Fetty. Understanding you might not be able to do all the things. So hopefully if you're not doing some of them and you like the way it sounds, you might be able to pick a couple and employ pieces of it. So that's where I want to at least give you the option to hear about that. For us, for me, when I am consulting, when I'm brought in, excuse me, to do an interview, I believe, and this is in line with the Fetty methodology specifically, that for an interview to be neutral and equitable, it has to be documented completely and accurately. And there's just no getting around that. Like that doesn't need to be more complicated than that. And it's actually incredibly simple. There's no substitute. And I'm just going to let you know, I think this is as important as doing the interview in a trauma-informed manner, or in a manner that is respectful of, encoding and retrieval and all of those things, regardless if somebody experienced trauma, stress, or anxiety. So sometimes I will see people do like an amazing interview. It was so well done, I'm observing it. And then I watch their process of documentation, and that's where it falls apart. Great interview, really terrible documentation. So I'm going to go through what that looks like and give you the options of what we do. Essentially, for me, the interview process, this continuum that we're talking about, it does not end when the interview does. So, and I see a lot of people misunderstand that. That's why I'm like, big exclamation point here. Just because the interview's over, for you as the practitioner, I believe it's not over until it has been properly documented. So when I go out and I do an interview, understanding I definitely have more time allotted for this, but I believe and I hope that your institutions over time really support in giving you time to not only do the interviews, which I know you may be struggling to get that time just for the interviews, but to understand that an interview has to include the documentation too. Otherwise, it can become meaningless for the process. It really can, and it can do very significant harm. So I try very, very hard when someone's bringing me in for an interview to communicate and to make sure that they understand the interview is only one part of the interview process. And so for me, I will not be done with what they have contracted for me to do until they have a report in their hand that is an accurate documentation of every single thing that happened in that interview. And that's where I do know some people are going to push back and not be happy, and they are going to hate this part. It is definitely the thing we get the most significant pushback about. So it's okay if you feel that way. I fought a long time against this until I just realized I was actually making it way harder for myself than I needed to be. So for us in Fetty, complete and accurate documentation is actually incredibly simple. It includes two parts. You have to record the entire interview. For us, that is video, but I do work with institutions that don't have the video capability, so they just do audio recording. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that needs to be recorded. And then second to the recording, there needs to be a complete written record that includes every audible word spoken by the interviewer and the participant in the order it occurred in the interview. So here's the reason. So I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, I wanted to clarify this is exactly it. And then I'm going to show you how we got to that point and why we got to that point. And, none of it's easy. I definitely am not trying to say that doing documentation in this style is easy, but I do think that you have an obligation to be honest and to be accurate. So if you're not going to take the time to actually document what was said, then you just need to acknowledge that. It just we need to make sure that whoever is making determinations based on the information you collected understands that it's not actually a true representation of what was said. So for instance, if you are not recording the interview and you're just taking notes, there's no way that you're being 100% accurate about what that person said. I mean, some people are better at note taking than others. Don't get me wrong. I've been very impressed by some people's note taking skills, but you're still not going to get everything 100% right. And you just want to be honest about it, right? I mean, there is no other way, it's one or the other. You either accurately recorded it and you know that your documentation is accurate because you have a recording to check on the accuracy with, or you don't. There's no in between in there. And we're going to talk about why that is. When I have seen people really push back on this, that's when I think some of the struggle for people who have been in the role of participant, where the frustration comes from them, because they might feel like they were misrepresented, they were misquoted, and there really isn't anywhere to go when there's not an audio or a video recording of that interview to see whether that happened or not. There really isn't. It's literally the interviewer's word versus the participants. And that's just an ugly struggle to get into that we want to avoid if we can. Understanding you may not have the capability. And I know Jeff is happy to talk about some, we won't say the specific organizations, but we know organizations that have started from just note taking and have since transitioned to video or audio recording. So it definitely can be done within the higher ed landscape. I'm not at all trying to say that it's easy. You definitely have to make a commitment to accuracy if you are going to do this, which we think is incredibly important. So the most accurate way for an interview to be documented is for it to capture both the words and the actions of the interviewer and the participant. So that's at the high level, the most accurate that you're going to get. And of course, that's video. We don't know of anything else at this point that is more accurate than that. But relying on an interviewer's memory or notes, honestly, it just creates inaccuracies, or it can create inaccuracies that are incorrectly attributed to the participant. So on top of that, if the participant disagrees with that, like I mentioned, there's really no way for them to verify who is correct. So strategically, you're creating an environment that's probably going to decrease the amount of information that participant's going to give to you. So I want to just call it like it is. This is adding problems if you're choosing not to do it this way. And we, like I said, we currently don't know of any other thing that's more accurate than video. Now, some people though are just going to be left with taking notes and writing the report. So what I want to just offer is that if you don't have the video to go back to, we just believe it's really important to call it out, like I mentioned. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of like what I used to do versus what I do now. And as long as you're being honest, I think, and I'm not at all saying that you would be dishonest on purpose, but what I see is that your documentation, your written report of the interview sometimes leaves out that what you are actually doing is not writing a report. You are providing a synopsis of what was said. So we just want to be really careful that whoever is reading your report, whatever you want to call that, is highlighted to the fact of the limitations and accuracy of the documentation that you chose to do. And then once you have that, you're sort of fine moving forward. It just is what it is. If your organization isn't going to let you video or audio record, you're stuck with going off of notes. I mean, it is what it is. I don't want to make you feel bad about that. You just want to make sure that whoever is looking at your report understands that that was the limitation that you had. And then that way, the accuracies or potentially the inaccuracies, because you're human, are not landing on the participant. So we want to be really, really clear about that. Jeff, do you have something before I move on to the report?
Sure. Before you get into writing the report, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the continuum of different documentation styles that we've seen over time and that we are seeing currently, as far as I can tell from my perspective, working with lots of schools around the country. I've seen a definite shift toward audio recording of interviews. I've not seen a shift toward video recording of interviews. I think that folks are understanding that it is more accurate and much simpler to audio record, and obviously it eliminates any step that involves summarizing, for example, and then having the participant review the notes and then determine whether they think you've accurately summarized. That adds a whole other layer to it that could end up, as I think you would say, Carrie, editing memory, and also might get you into disputes about what they actually said. I've certainly seen that play out in practice. That becomes particularly difficult, and even more so if you have very active advisors who might be lawyers or parents, or someone who ends up essentially trying to edit what the person actually said through the methodology of editing the notes. And it's not that they're necessarily doing anything intentionally, but they're misunderstanding the nature of what you're asking them to do in double checking a summary. You're not asking them to reframe what they said. You're just asking them to confirm that you have accurately summarized what they said. Those are very different things, but folks sometimes get in an advocacy mode. On reflection, they wish they'd said something different. All of that can get really difficult. The methodology that I've seen work very well currently is audio recording. I've seen at times schools send transcripts to participants or witnesses in advance to make sure that the transcription was accurately done by a court reporter or a service as an additional step. I don't think that's mandatory, but it's something that can be helpful if you can incorporate that into your process. But that is where I think we are right now. One thing to note about the addition of video is, because we have an obligation under the current regulations to share with both parties all of the information gathered in the connection with the investigation, any video that is created would have to be shared with the other party. So if you have a video of a complainant or a respondent being interviewed, that video would have to be shared in a raw form with the other party, as opposed to maybe a transcript, which may be enough, or an audio recording, which is a little harder for them to use, so they might refer just to the transcript instead. The reason I note that is you may have a party who's very self-conscious about having their comments, their interview be viewed by the other person, because they feel very vulnerable, and it could be either party having that happen. So that's something that schools may, particularly if we start moving toward more video, schools may give some thought to that as a potential con in the pro-con analysis. No question that what you're saying is true, Carrie, that the more information you have, including the video, is going to be a more accurate representation of the interview. But on the con side of it is that going to end up being intimidating to parties, given that we have these rules that require sharing of that sort? We'll probably continue to see changes in these things as we go along, and I'm glad we're having the conversation at this point, and I'm glad we're seeing a move toward more accurate representation in the form, at least, of audio. And if we're going to stay with summaries, the regs would be okay with that. We have to summarize relevant evidence, and there's nothing to the contrary. But we're going to end up having to probably share notes with folks to have them at least validate that they don't disagree with how we've summarized their thoughts.
Absolutely, yes. And it's interesting, Jeff, that you bring up the video. There's two institutions, I would say, within the last, I guess it's been over a year now, that are currently navigating that. So I do think it's gonna be something that comes up. I do think that it's too soon to know necessarily how that's gonna play out, but I love that people are at least considering it. And I do agree, like, I think more that I'm seeing, it's more audio. And at the bare minimum, and we'll talk here in a minute about sort of the way we triage documentation, but at the bare minimum, we hope that people have audio. Not only is it more accurate, I think it's kinder to you as an interviewer that has to do the documentation, because it can be so hard to write a report just from notes. So I really appreciate all of that perspective. And I do think that we have to be mindful of how things are going to be used, but also just being careful about assumptions on that. I mean, it can be hard. What we have heard from participants, and I just throw this out there as sort of food for thought, is sometimes we make assumptions about things that are going to be intimidating, and it could be, right? I don't want to diminish that, but also what I found in some of these processes, and when we're coming up with our policies around this, that there's a lot of assumptions instead of truly really asking people, like, help me understand your thoughts about this. You know, what if any concerns would you have about being video recorded? Things like that, right? And then trying to get more information about that, rather than just sort of saying, wow, this seems like it would be. Because the things in my sort of experience and past that I thought my participants would be worried about or concerned about, I was often wrong about. That was more me thinking it, and where I have seen the frustration and people being sort of unhappy with the process has really been around inaccurate documentation. Not at all do I want to diminish though the intimidation factor of having a video. So I'm not diminishing that. I just think it's good to remember that currently where we see harm, where we see frustration, is in the inaccurate documentation. And that's something that thankfully we can sort of achieve a fix on, not super easily, because I do acknowledge this takes more time to write a report in the manner we're going to talk about, but it's possible. Like there's very few things that at least I know of or I'm aware of that would prohibit you from hopefully at the bare minimum audio recording. So I want to just give you an example of how I got to this, how we have made this a requirement for our advanced interviewers. So again, this is not a requirement for FETI. It is a requirement under certified FETI if you're going to be an advanced interviewer and be sort of brought in by an organization to do that under that designation. So if I get brought in, I actually have to do a report in the manner I'm going to describe to you. It's not an option for me to do the synopsis. And the synopsis that you're looking at right now is the synopsis that's from one of my reports from when I was, pre-doing any sort of documentation in this style. This is exactly what would have been in my report. So, the date, the time, who was interviewed, the location of the interview. And then I said this was just boilerplate copy and paste for me. What follows is a summary of an interview. And then I would say the following summary is not necessarily in the order in which it was discussed for ease of the reader. None of it is meant to replace the record of the video recording. Now, at the time, this was absolutely best practice, at least in the place that I was working. But I will tell you, we did a lot of trainings nationwide, and this was pretty consistent for best practice. It's still what I see in a lot of places that we go today when people are providing a synopsis. What I still like about it is that it's honest. We were not saying that it was anything other than a synopsis. We weren't saying it was an accurate record of it. We were clearly indicating that if you needed something to be exact, you needed to go and watch the video recording. Now, what I don't like about that is that I abdicated my responsibility as the interviewer to do the documentation. This was policy driven and somewhat driven by tradition, in that also we just kind of didn't feel like we had time to do it. And I want to say that that's true. But I just had to come to a place where I realized the interview wasn't done until it was properly documented. So what I do now is an interview report for every interview. So I'm often brought in to do the investigation that includes the interview. So it's probably similar to some of you that are on the call, you're doing all the pieces. That is still true for me in many of the institutions that I work for, but I am making sure to separate out the interview from the investigation. So every single interview that I do gets an interview report like you see here on the right side of your screen. Again, not a requirement. I just want to offer this as an option, but you can see the difference because my overview is very clear that this is not a synopsis or a summary of the interview. All information gathered from the interview participant has been included in the order it was obtained during the interview. So just note the difference. In a synopsis, my goal was to make it easy for the reader, right? Who in that time was probably like an assistant district attorney or something like that. Now my goal is to be accurate. Now, I take the information from my interview report and I include it in a larger investigative report. That investigative report includes timelines. It's definitely better, more ease for the reader, right? I'm referencing in that investigative report my interview report. And so I really still, because this isn't an investigations training, but I'm focusing on making sure that when I do that investigation or somebody else does that investigation, they have my interview report and it includes everything that happened in that interview. So, as an example of what that looks like, every single word that was spoken when I do, and this is an example of one of my reports, every single word gets documented. I don't leave anything out. Again, I know not all of you are going to be able to do this, but I just want to let you know, this is where I've landed. If I'm going to be accurate, if I'm going to truly be fair and neutral and equitable, every person that gets interviewed gets documentation in this way. because not only can you sort of choose, right, what is important, which can not be fair. What you think is important might ultimately not or may need somebody else to look at in a different way. You really want to make sure that you're not making the determination, especially at the beginning of an investigation, what's important and what isn't. And so I've just found this is a lot fairer, and it just allows me to be a lot more effective in my investigation. So I have all of these interview reports throughout my entire investigation, and I don't have to sit back and watch the interview. I have it here, and I can go directly to how did they say it? What were the exact words that they used? And then really, really critically, what was the question that elicited that? And now here's the other benefit to choosing to document in this style. You cannot hide from how you do an interview. And I think that that is a great enhancement to skill, because it's literally in black and white how you asked it. Was it a leading question? Was it, not a great question? Did you introduce information that wasn't in there? How did the participant give you the information? What brought it together? Not only do you see that when you create this report, but the person who is reading it later, who might not be you, can also have that answered, also has more information, like was this information collected? What way was it? What mechanism was used? So it's more accurate, but it will also have this wonderful benefit of enhancing your skill set as an interviewer. Probably more than anything else, this shift for me is what has made me a better interviewer, because it's not a transcription. So I am fine with people sending stuff out for a transcription. Some people are fast typers, some people aren't, but at least for us, it does not take away the responsibility for whoever did the interview to still either listen or watch the interview that actually occurred and make sure that the transcript is accurate. So there is no, we send it out for a transcription and then we turn in the report, because it's not a transcript, it's an interview report. And, we may have to change words that the transcription, whoever, created the transcription got wrong, things like that. And we also put in the time. So the other thing that I just wanted to quickly mention that we choose to do is we put in the time of the audio or video recording every time the interviewer asks a question. And that's really just for ease of use for whoever is potentially needing to go back and find information out later, listen or watch to a section of the interview. It takes me no extra time to do this because I'm already writing it. And we found it's really, really helpful to the follow-on process. So the reason we're bringing this up here is this is part of the continuum, right? This is understanding how is all that great information that you collected actually going to be utilized, and knowing that interview that you've conducted isn't or really shouldn't be considered done until it is accurately documented. And you just have to decide that, what does that mean to you? Like, you individually have to decide what accuracy means to you. This is just what it means to us. So if you are unable to do that, I did want to, before we sort of break for questions here, give you at least what we believe is sort of the waterfall or the cascade of documentation options. So of course, at the top, video recording, we believe is the best, because sometimes people describe things with their physical body, or movement could be really critical based on what you are investigating or what you are trying to collect information about. But of course, for all the reasons Jeff mentioned, and I'm sure many others, you might only have audio recording. If you can't audio record, and again, these aren't recommendations, these are just sort of a triage of options. We believe note-taking by an observer who's outside the room is then sort of like your best option. If you can't do that, then an observer inside the room. And then at the, sort of at the bottom of this would be note-taking by the interviewer. Now, what's interesting is most of the teams that I work with, particularly in higher education, it's the note-taking by the interviewer that's happening when it's documentation. So we know that. It's why we're spending some time here just to highlight the sort of, not only the inaccuracies, but just how hard that is on you. If you're left with that as your only option, it is really, really difficult to provide that level of accuracy that I'm sure you want, right? I'm sure most of the people who are doing interviews want to be incredibly accurate. So this is descending order of documentation options that we advise. Jeff and I are happy to provide more information on this if you would like any more. All right, so what I would like to do is just bring us back as we are opening this up, and I know Dan is going to let us know if there's some questions, into what we have said the entire time of just adopting a continuum mindset for information gathering. That has been everything we've been talking about today. It's understanding that just because the interview is done for you, it's not necessarily done for your participant. What I want to mention as we wrap up is a reminder about this bulldozing idea that we talked about in the second webinar. Please go back and watch that if you haven't had a chance to, because I do think this is pretty critical. And I would love to just provide a reminder right now that as this continuum happens and you find yourself potentially needing to clarify, right? Like we mentioned before, you're gonna have to do that when you're in that investigative role. There's nothing wrong with clarifying, but remember, when you come back in and you're in information gathering, you wanna make sure and sweep all that stuff out, take it out of your brain. And even if it's your second, third, or fourth interview with this same participant, try and go in as blank as you can. Try not to take the first 1, 2, 3, or 4 interviews in with you. And I'm not saying that you go in and you re-interview. Just acknowledge that they may remember new information, what was central to them, right? They might be able to provide new information about. They also might have just told you something that wasn't true. I mean, that has to be as much an option as anything for how the brain encodes memories or retrieves memories. Some people lie. I'm not saying everybody lies, but if you're going to truly be neutral and equitable, everything has to be an option. What you don't want to do is go in with an assumption that somebody is either telling the truth or lying. You're just going in and giving an opportunity for the person to share what they're able to. And the continuum of this interview experience is going to let you get more in that mindset and hopefully get in the way of maybe frustration or the leading questions or all the things that we see happen when you start trying to do that investigation in the interview. And then hopefully you're able to remember to keep that information going one way, even if it is more of the clarifying piece, more of, hey, I went and got this other information and now I need to go back and actually let this person give me information about this, or at least provide them with the opportunity to give information. Just as a reminder, you would still want that to be unidirectional. You would still want to make sure that it's the person talking, not you talking at them, not you trying to convince them of something or anything else. So this continuum is actually incredibly simple. Nothing changes. If you're going to do really good trauma-informed principles, open-ended interviewing, it should be that way the entire time you're interacting with people and gathering information from them. All right, Jeff, I think we have a couple of questions.
We do. One is, I think, pretty easy, quick. I'll take that one first. So the question is, why is a note taker outside the room better than inside the room? And I'll just add my perspective on the higher ed flair to this, which is I'm not aware of higher ed Title IX administrative investigations as opposed to what law enforcement might be doing on a campus or outside of a campus. I'm not aware of using a practice where you're using, a one-way mirror or something like that in order to have folks outside the room observing the interview. Maybe you've seen that, Carrie. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, we actually have seen, I mean, I'm not going to say a ton of organizations, but there definitely has been some, shall I say, technology marketed to institutions that is being able to observe over a computer, right? So like, it's not that it's being recorded, which is interesting. It's that you can observe it. So the ones that I know of that have sort of tiptoed in this direction, it's at least appeared to be very driven by information with the participants. So for instance, we have an ability to have somebody else take notes today so that I can better, pay attention to the words that you're using or to the information that you're sharing. In order to do that, we have an option for the person who is taking notes to not be in the room and to just observe from a different location through this camera. Help me understand your thoughts about that. That's sort of how I've seen them do it. And it tends to, again, just be sort of an option to limit the distractions in the interview room. So specifically to answer that question, that's one of the reasons it's higher on the triage list, is every time you introduce another person into the interview environment, you are also introducing potential distractions. So, not a lot of people have that as an option. And we do see, like I mentioned, honestly, most of the places just do their own note taking, and then if you go backwards up that list, if they're not going to do their own note taking, the person is in the room because they don't have that technology option. But if we're going to go off of best practice and what's best for the interview itself, it would be the way that it's described in that triage list.
Okay, that helps a lot, Carrie, because when I hear you describing it as a way that another person can take notes without being a distraction in the room or seeming, I will guess, maybe more intimidating. Again, I'm speculating, but the possibility that someone could feel that two people are sitting there glaring at them while they're sharing things that they don't want to talk about. That's a different than the picture I was seeing, which was more of a law enforcement one-way mirror scenario, which I didn't see fitting terribly well with what we do in our administrative investigations. I will say that that seems to me fine if someone is amenable to it, because it is a very common practice, particularly where we don't have campuses using audio recording, for example, where they will have two people involved in the interview, and one tends to take the lead on the asking of questions and the other takes notes, so as to allow the person doing the interview to have that engagement and be moving in a queuing direction rather than trying to document and queue simultaneously, which obviously can be very difficult to do effectively and distracting to participants, which is really a problem. So, okay, that I think is a helpful clarification on that one. And the other question wonders about whether we can share best practices regarding the drafting of an interview summary for record-keeping purposes, or a participant statement, particularly where we're not able to use audio video recordings, or where organization practices don't allow that. So the person is interested in things like the order of the summary, should the interviewer's questions be reflected word for word, should the participants' responses be reflected word to word, or is summarization acceptable, etc. So Carrie, with the premise that we're in the summary world, what are your thoughts on that, knowing that it's not your preference?
Yeah, Jeff knows exactly. He's heard me say this response a lot. I empathize with that because I'm just going to go back to this. This was the world that I lived in for a very, very long time. So I like the synopsis that you see on the left. I just think that you have to call yourself out and be honest about what did and didn't happen. So I don't actually think there's anything wrong with what is on the left. If that's truly what you're doing, that's probably, if I was left with doing a synopsis, that's pretty close to how I would probably start. And then I still would say, try not to put things in order. There's just so much wrong with that. And it's why I'm left with the accurate way that I do it now. If you are going off of notes, this is so dependent on the type of note taker you are. I would recommend just looking at your notes and trying to do the best that you can based off of your recall to document what's in your notes, and just say that. It's interesting because when we answer this question, it really highlights the problem with documenting an interview this way. A synopsis is just that. It is inherently you trying to remember what somebody else said. And then you just also have to acknowledge that that means you paid attention to certain things, that because it's you, right? You sort of have an intake of information differently, because your brain is going to sort of focus on information differently than the way that the person was sharing it. All of that stuff is just true, so if you're going off of notes, I really encourage people to include their actual notes. I know that this is policy driven. I have 2 institutions that I work with right now that don't keep their notes. Once they do their synopsis, they actually get rid of their notes. I sort of hate that. I'll just call it out like it is. I think it's, if you're going to be creating documentation off of another set of documentation, it can be really helpful for whoever is using that documentation to know what the root sort of piece of information was. So I think that's my other recommendation, is don't get rid of any notes if that's how you are documenting your report. Now, if you are audio or video recording, we're fine. Like at that point, if you have any notes, the most accurate documentation is going to be the recording. So it becomes less important to preserve those notes, though I'm still a fan of not getting rid of anything. So yeah, I mean, I hate to not be super helpful on that, but it's just that I can't turn a synopsis into something that it's not. You can only go off of what you sort of gathered during the interview. What I will say, in trying to help some organizations that are just really left with this, is I found it kind of can help to be really honest with your participant in the beginning and to acknowledge the limitations. So I might train somebody to say something like, would it be okay if I provided information on my process during the interview today and how I'm going to document the words that you say? So again, asking for permission, usually the person will say yes. And then it just might be as simple as just calling out, like, I'm going to, because we don't record the interviews, I do need to take notes. And so it might be that during the interview today, I'm writing, and there might be some lengthier pauses because I'm trying to write information down. I think it's okay to just call that out. It's not like they're not going to see you doing it. But again, you can see the issue with that. I mean, it is definitely an interruption when you are taking notes in an interview. There's just no getting around it. It's going to potentially impact the amount of information somebody is able to share, which is the real unfortunate part of it. But I think at that point, you have to weigh, again, accuracy versus interruption. And if, I was left with only doing it this way, I would slow that interview down even more. I would be taking pretty extensive notes because I would want to be as accurate as possible in my documentation. And there just wouldn't be another way to do that based on just my memory. I know my memory of an interview is so different. I can think that I heard somebody say something, and then when I go back and I create my report, because I watched the interview to do that, it still astounds me. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, I could have sworn the person said that. And then I'll watch the whole interview, create the whole report, and they didn't say it. And I mean, that has just really instilled in me how inaccurate note-taking and synopsis are. Yeah. I wish I had a better answer for that, but it wouldn't be accurate.
So Carrie, I'll just observe on that, on the preservation of things, talk with your institutional counsel about that as my recommendation there, because we really do need to be thoughtful of their take on what judges in your jurisdiction are going to think about document preservation obligations and any internal policies you have around that. I tend to be someone who likes to have everything be retained on the assumption that these are good documents, that more detail in the event of a dispute is going to be helpful to better corroborate the validity and appropriateness and professionalism that was reflected in the work that you did. So that's typically my default, but you're going to want to talk with counsel about that. And then just generally on documentation, I think being upfront about this is a summary. That's what I'm going to be creating, and giving the opportunity to a participant to observe what you've created and let them comment on it. Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't get to rewrite it, but you may end up with a track changes document that becomes part of the record, where they reflect on what they believe you got right or what they didn't, and that document, the track changes version, may end up being the document. You have your summary as best you feel it portrayed what the decision maker ought to know as a backup to the report that you're going to write that summarizes relevant evidence for Title IX purposes. And then you may have a couple different versions: your initial version, the version as commented upon by the participant, and then you've got your summary, which is going to be the higher level. But if someone needs to dig in, if a decision maker needs to dig in because a party wants to bring up issues around the interview later, or they're just interested in further detail, they'll be able to do that, and they'll have the documentation available to do it. And there's a question: are there any specific programs or apps you use to record interviews? And I'll just say my practice, for whatever it's worth, has been to use just digital recording app, and not even an app, just a digital recorder. and to have it transcribed by a commercial service. But Carrie, I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, great question there. So I kind of appreciate not overly complicating stuff just because when I find that you make it too difficult, it's when you don't use it. So the thing that tends to be used the most that I see people use is actually the recording feature on their phone. Now, I'm hesitant on that because you have to be careful about using a personal digital device, right, in these processes. So of course, take that into consideration. But the reason I bring it up is that's what I see people do the most, is just like pull out their phone and hit the recording piece of it. On that, you do have to be careful about recording ability, like how long, what's your storage capability if you're going to use a device like that, making sure it's plugged in. I mean, I can do an entire hour just on the sort of pieces that we see people mess up just on the technology aspect. Short of that, I see people use the same thing on like a computer. I can't even tell you how many interviews I've gotten that were a QuickTime recording, on a Mac or whatever the version is on a PC. Again, test that. I mean, that's probably the biggest mistake I see is people don't do like a practice test before, and maybe they have an audio that's not working and they do an entire interview and there was no audio the entire time. I mean, that's happened. It's awful when that happens. So, test whatever you're going to use, but try and make it simple so that you actually use it. I would hesitate to encourage some of these downloadable applications, and that's because of security. So for instance, we have to be really, really careful internally with our interviewing center, and then also just like the online trainings that we do. Most of the apps don't pass our security requirements and probably wouldn't for your institutions either. So be really careful about that. There's some applications for transcription that I've seen people get excited about because like they function really well, but the data collection and the data storage, when you upload that for transcription or you upload it for the recording to happen, the company actually now owns that data. And that can be really problematic for your institution. So of course, I hope these are things that you would be clearing, like Jeff said, with your general counsel, and be really, really careful. I mean, anytime you're uploading something as sensitive as these interviews are, you want to be overthinking anything about where that information is going. Because of that, I like keeping stuff internal. So again, a cell phone that only you have access to that's not being uploaded to the cloud, you're uploading that to whatever storage system you have internally at your institution that you would be scanning and uploading a written report to. Transcribing only using, like Jeff said, a commercial thoroughly vetted service. I mean, there's plenty of them available that are used widely by criminal justice organizations and very well vetted. So I would only encourage stuff like that. But still, I go back to if you're going to do the interview, my hope is that you're also responsible for the documentation of it, because it will honestly make you a better interviewer, and you'll probably also identify things in your investigation that you didn't even hear when the interview was happening. The other one that I would say is just a good old digital recorder that you can buy off Amazon. I travel with a go bag everywhere I go. It has my laptop. It has 3 individual digital recorders, all of them that plug in with USB. It's a bit of overkill, but I have those digital recorders going in every single interview I do, just in case the main system recording fails. And I will tell you, I've been really glad to have that. I delete it if I don't need it once I confirm that the original recording is fine, because you don't need like 4 versions of it. But I have all of those as backup, and they are in the room with permission from the participant every single time. And the reason I have so many is I have one that's positioned sort of out of eyesight of the participant, like they know it's there, but I don't want them staring at it the whole time. So it's sort of somewhere that's going to easily pick up their voice. And then I have one near me that's going to easily pick up my voice. And then I also just have one sort of in the center of the room. I tend to know that with those 3 going, should something fail, I have that documented somewhere. And most of those recorders, I mean, I have the same one that I bought, 4 or 5 years ago. They're like $30, $40 on Amazon. So they're incredibly inexpensive, and you don't want a complicated one. It just plugs into the computer, takes maybe a couple minutes to upload. When I'm done with that, and that can be incredibly helpful. So I do that even if we're recording on a phone or a computer.
Okay, those are the questions we got, Carrie. I think I'll just wrap up for myself saying thanks so much for everyone for being with us. This has really been a great opportunity. I've learned a lot from Carrie as always. Thank you for your questions, and hope that we can continue to work together on these issues. And it's good validation that Department of Ed is supporting use of trauma-informed practices across the board with all of our interviews with complainants, respondents, witnesses. And I'm just glad, very, very glad to be part of the process of getting the word out about these techniques, and hope that it's improving the standard for our interviews in the work that we do. So thank you for the work that you do in that regard.
Yes, and everything that Jeff said, massive echo on that. Thanks to all of you for showing up and hanging in with us. I will just finally say, the downstream effect that we talked about in the beginning, so incredibly simple. It's good and bad, right? The good downstream effect is if you do things like this, and you don't have to call it anything specific, you just have really good interviewing skill sets, you're going to get more information for your other process. It's as simple as that. And the alternative is, I think, if you choose to maybe do more traditional things, what we've seen the downstream effect of is you don't get more information. And so I just wanted to wrap with that, because it really is pretty simple. And that's been my biggest learning curve over the years, is that oftentimes just the simplest thing can be the most effective. So thank you, everybody, for the work that you do. We look forward to hearing continued questions. Please feel free to get a hold of us if we can help. Information is available on certifiedfetty.com how to do that. And Jeff, thank you so much. It was fun doing the webinar series with you.
You too, Carrie. Thank you. And folks, I just Google me. You can see my contact info in the slides and so on, or just Google my name at Holland Knight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.